The nightmare clung to Felicity Ward even after she jolted awake in the gray hour before dawn. In the dream, Virgil Cain had stood at the edge of her spring laughing while shadows shaped like mounted warriors circled closer, their faces hidden, their intentions unknowable. She had tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Tried to scream, but no sound came. Then Thomas's voice, faint and accusatory, "You let them take everything." She sat up on the pile of feed sacks in the barn, heart hammering against her ribs, sweat cooling on her skin despite the pre-dawn chill. Just a dream. But the fear stayed with her as she pulled on her boots and stepped into the yard, where the first pale light was breaking over the hills. The hand pump wheezed and rattled under her weight, spitting one last cupful of water into the trough before it surrendered entirely. She leaned harder on the iron handle dust, already coating the front of her faded calico dress, sweat beginning to carve fresh tracks down her temples. The mare standing by the barn door lifted her head and nickered softly, ribs showing under a coat that had lost its shine weeks ago. Felicity remembered Thomas's hand going slack in hers as he bled out under the overturned wagon, remembered the way his eyes had stayed open, staring at nothing. She remembered walking back to the house alone, knowing she would walk alone forever. A year later, that aloneness had teeth. It followed her through every chore, every sleepless night, every moment she spent looking over her shoulder, wondering when Virgil Cain would finally come to collect what he believed he was owed. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand and bent to check the wagon wheel she had been trying to prop for repair. The wood was cracked, the iron rim loose. She wedged a stick under the rim and leaned in to test the angle. The stick snapped. The wheel dropped and swung toward her ankle. Felicity jerked back hard, lost her balance, and crashed into the dirt with a jarring thud that knocked the breath from her lungs. For a heartbeat, she lay there, staring up at the bleached white sky, tasting dust. The bruise would be ugly. The wheel could have been worse. She pushed herself up onto her elbows and froze. Hoofbeats rolled across the brittle prairie from the east. Not the heavy clatter of shod horses from town, but the softer, faster rhythm of unshod ponies moving in formation. She scrambled to her feet, brushing dirt from her skirt, and shaded her eyes against the sun. A small party of riders crested the low rise beyond the fence line and headed straight for her corral. 6 men, maybe 7. At the front rode a man she recognized, even at a distance. Nidus, tall, lean, his black hair tied back with a simple leather thong, a single crow feather tucked behind one ear. His buckskin shirt was dusty and torn at one shoulder, not the kind of ceremonial dress white men expected Indians to wear, but the working clothes of a man who had been traveling hard and sleeping rough. The riders slowed as they approached the fence and dismounted just beyond the barn door. Felicity's fingers clutched at the front of her dress, smoothing the fabric over her hips in a gesture that was half reflex, half panic. The shadows from her dream flickered at the edge of her vision. In town, the men had whispered things. They said the drought was making everyone desperate. They said Indians would take what they wanted if things got worse. They said a woman alone was a fool to trust anyone, let alone a Lakota warrior who had no reason to care about white laws or white debts. Nidus stepped forward, his dark eyes taking in the dry trough, the cracked yard, and the open barn where her late husband's tools still hung on their pegs, unused and rusting. His gaze moved to her face and stayed there, steady and unreadable. "Your spring still runs," he said in careful, deliberate English. "My people remember." Felicity swallowed. Her throat was as dry as the pump. She remembered what Virgil Cain had said to her just yesterday, leaning against the counter in the mercantile while she counted out coins for flour. Virgil owned more cattle than any man on this side of the territory, and most of the men who rode for those cattle. He was broad-shouldered and silver-haired with a smile that never reached his eyes. "If that Lakota comes asking about your debt," Virgil had said loud enough for the whole store to hear, "he won't be talking coin. A young widow alone. He'll want your body before he wants the water. The words had made her skin crawl. They made her skin crawl now, standing in her own yard with Nidus 10 feet away, and his men silent behind him. Nidus took another step closer, dust puffing under his moccasins. He stopped at a respectful distance, but close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the scar along his jaw, the weariness that came from riding too far on too little sleep. "We must speak about your body," he said. Felicity's blood turned to ice. The riverbed that once gave Prairie Dawn its name was now a cracked ribbon of baked mud running east to west through the valley. Wells were going bad all over the territory. Cattle were collapsing in the fields, tongues swollen, eyes glazed. The only steady source of water for miles around was the stone-ringed spring on Felicity Ward's small hay ranch, and the narrow creek that ran from it down through the low hills toward the dry river. Felicity's husband, Thomas Ward, had died under an overturned wagon a year earlier. He had been hauling fence posts alone, trying to finish repairs before the first snow. The wagon tongue snapped. The load shifted. By the time Barnaby Holt found him, it was too late. Felicity had buried him on the hillside, above the spring marked the grave, with a plain wooden cross, and cried until there were no more tears left. To keep the ranch, she had signed a loan with Virgil Cain. The papers had been shoved across a desk at her when she could barely see through grief, when the numbers and words swam together and made no sense. She could read simple things, receipts, labels, the Bible, but legal documents were another matter entirely. She only knew there was a mortgage, and if she missed a payment, everything was gone. In town, people knew her as the widow who lived alone. Some pitied her. Some whispered that she should have remarried quickly while she still had the ranch to offer. Others, mostly the women, quietly admired her stubbornness and brought her jars of preserves or sacks of cornmeal when their husbands weren't looking. Prairie Dawn itself was a dusty crossroads of false-fronted buildings clustered around a single rutted street. The mercantile, the land office, the telegraph station, the saloon, and Dr. Theodore Ames's cramped office above the barber shop made up the heart of the settlement. The church stood at one end of the street, whitewashed and stiff. The sheriff's office stood at the other, equally stiff, but less whitewashed. Dr. Theodore Ames was a weary man in his 40s, gray at the temples with spectacles that slid down his nose when he bent over a patient. He had come west after the war looking for a place where the wounds weren't so deep. He had found a different kind of wound, instead heat stroke, bad water, starvation, violence. He saw more of it every week. He kept his medical bag packed and his horse saddled because emergencies didn't wait for office hours. Lucia was the telegraph operator, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s who had learned Morse code from her father and taken over the station when he died. She kept a private notebook, small and black, hidden under the loose floorboard beneath her desk. In it, she recorded suspicious messages, patterns, names that appeared too often in transactions that smelled wrong. Virgil Cain's name appeared on more pages than anyone else's. Barnaby Holt was a struggling neighbor farmer, a man in his 50s with a bad back and a worse conscience. He owed Virgil money for seed and equipment, and he was too afraid to say no when Virgil asked him to ride along on ugly business. Barnaby had found Thomas Ward's body. He blamed himself for not checking on his neighbor sooner. The guilt ate at him, but not enough to make him brave. Not yet. Back in the yard, Felicity stood facing Nidus, her cheeks burning with humiliation and fear. Around them, the other Lakota riders waited in silence, holding the reins of their ponies, watching without judgment. My body. She echoed the words, barely audible. Nidus shook his head and gestured past her to the low rise behind the barn where the spring bubbled up from a circle of stones and fed the narrow creek. "The body of land," he said. "The place where the water begins. Virgil Cain says it's his now. If he closes it, my people must drink from poisoned wells or leave this valley." The misunderstanding crashed over her like a bucket of cold water. Humiliation flooded her face, followed immediately by relief so sharp it made her knees weak. She had believed the worst of him, because a white man with power had told her to. She had stood there ready to defend herself against an attack that was never coming. "I thought you meant..." She couldn't finish the sentence. She looked down at her dusty boots, unable to meet his eyes. He read enough in her expression. His voice softened, though his face remained still. "Many white men think a woman's body is part of a debt," he said quietly. "I ain't here for that. No one owns you." The certainty in his voice hit harder than any compliment she had ever received. Since Thomas's death, every handshake from town had come with an implied price. Every offer of help had been weighted with expectation. Standing in front of her now, this Lakota warrior was the first man to say out loud that she wasn't something to be collected or claimed. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely and forced herself to look at him. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't have thought that." "You were told to think it," Nidus replied. "That ain't your fault." Behind them, the spring murmured softly over stone. One of the other riders, a younger man with a scar across his cheekbone, stepped forward and spoke rapidly in Lakota. Nidus answered in the same language, gesturing toward the barn, and then the creek. The younger man frowned, but nodded. Nidus turned back to Felicity. "This is Elsu, my cousin," he said. "He says we're wasting time talking when we should be moving. He ain't wrong." Felicity wiped her face with her sleeve. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "If Virgil says the land's his, I don't know how to stop him. I signed papers. Can't read all the words, but I signed them." "Then we find the words you signed," Nidus said, "and we move fast." The fragile understanding between them shattered an hour later when the sound of heavier hooves rolled into the yard. Virgil Cain rode in from the west, with 2 hired men behind him, dust coating his tailored coat and polished boots. His belt shone with silver conchos, each one stamped with his brand. He was smiling. He slapped a folded paper against the barn wall, the sound sharp as a gunshot. "You missed last month's payment," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. 30 days, Felicity. You pay in full or the ranch, the spring, and every weed on it is mine." Felicity's stomach dropped. She had known the payment was due, but she had been counting on selling the hay before the deadline. The railroad work crews near Drought Creek were desperate for feed. She had planned to haul it there next week. Now next week might be too late. When Virgil noticed Nidus standing near the barn door, his smile thinned into something colder. "You think these people will save you," he said, jerking his chin toward the Lakota riders. "They'll be the first ones I drive off once the deed's clean." Nidus stepped forward, placing himself between Virgil and Felicity without seeming to move quickly. It was the kind of positioning a man learned when violence was always a possibility. "This land lies on the border of our treaty hunting ground," he said. "The spring fed our horses before your grandfathers were born." Virgil leaned forward in the saddle close enough that Felicity could smell whiskey on his breath, even from where she stood. "You signed the papers, widow," he said, eyes fixed on her. "And you can't even sit on a jury, let alone argue law. 30 days, then my men move in and your friends here can argue with bullets." He spurred his horse around in a tight circle, kicking up dust that coated Felicity's boots and the hem of her dress, and rode out with his men flanking him. The silence that followed was worse than the confrontation. Felicity stood very still, staring at the paper nailed to the barn. Nidus watched her waiting. Finally, she said, "If he takes this place, your people lose the water. If I fight him and lose you, still lose the water. Either way, you're risking yourselves for nothing." "Not nothing," Nidus said. "For what's right," Right don't mean much when the law's written by men like him. Then we change what the law sees. That night in the dim barn, with a single lantern swinging from a nail, Felicity and Nidus worked out a desperate bargain. His band would camp downstream along the creek and help her cut and haul the hay early before Virgil could interfere. She would sell it to the railroad work crews near Drought Creek, where prices were sky high because of the drought. The money would cover the payment. In return, she would sign an agreement granting his people legal right to the spring and file it at the land office in town before Virgil could tighten his hold on the property. If the agreement was recorded first, it would complicate any attempt to close the water. Survival tied them together. If they failed to raise the money or secure the water rights, Virgil won, and both their communities lost. There was no room for mistrust. There was only work. Elsu, standing in the shadows near the barn door, spoke again in Lakota. His tone was sharp. Nidus answered more quietly, but firmly. Elsu shook his head and walked out. "He don't trust this," Nidus said. "Figures you'll take the money and leave us with nothing." "Will you?" "No." "Then we begin at dawn." Work began before the sun cleared the hills. Lakota riders moved through the fields with scythes taken as pay from Army scouts years ago, the blades flashing in the early light. Felicity drove the team pulling the hay wagon, her hands blistered from the reins, while Nidus pitched bales up from the ground. His shirt was dark with sweat by mid-morning, the torn shoulder seam gaping wider with each load. The rhythm was hard, but steady. No one spoke much. There was no breath to waste. The first blow from Virgil came at noon. Someone had sliced the rawhide rigging on the wooden flume that carried overflow from the spring to the troughs in the pasture. In the heat of afternoon, the flume collapsed and sent a sheet of precious water flooding uselessly into the dust, carving a muddy gash across the yard before it soaked away. Felicity and Nidus sprinted to the dry riverbed, with shovels trying to cut a channel that would catch the runoff before it disappeared entirely. The earth was baked hard as brick. Each swing of the shovel jarred her arms to the shoulders. Sweat stung her eyes. Beside her, Nidus hacked at the ground. With mechanical precision, lips pressed tight. They were waist-deep in the trench when two of Virgil's riders appeared on the bank above them, horses stamping, rifles resting across their saddles. "Look at that," one of them called a man, with a drooping mustache and a voice like gravel. "Indian and widow playing farmer. Reckon he'll work off her debt after dark, too." The words stung worse than the sun. Felicity's grip on the shovel faltered. Her face burned. She wanted to shout back, but her throat closed up. Nidus stepped into the open water channel, placing his body between her and the men on the bank. Muddy water swirled around his knees. "Right away," he said, voice flat and cold. "Before I forget, you hide behind your boss's name." Hands drifted toward rifle stocks. The air shimmered with heat and tension. For a long, dangerous moment, no one moved. Then the man with the mustache spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dirt and jerked his reins. "You got 30 days, widow," he said. "Then you got nothing." They rode off slowly, making it clear they were choosing to leave, not being driven away. Felicity exhaled and leaned on her shovel, trembling. Nidus climbed out of the trench and picked up his own shovel without looking at her. "Thank you," she said quietly. "They'll be back." "I know." That evening, after the flume was crudely repaired with green willow branches and strips of canvas, they worked side by side, stacking the last bales in the barn. The day's heat had left them both exhausted. Felicity's face was streaked with dirt and sweat, her hair falling out of its pins. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a muddy smear. Nidus watched her for a moment, then reached out and gently brushed the dirt from her brow with his thumb. The touch was brief, careful, his calloused hand surprisingly gentle. He said nothing, just met her eyes for a heartbeat before turning back to the hay. Felicity stood very still, her heart hammering for reasons that had nothing to do with the work. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched heavy and charged. Outside, the horses stamped and blew in the corral. The lantern flickered. Finally, she cleared her throat. "We should rest," she said. "Tomorrow will be worse." Nidus nodded once and climbed the ladder to the loft where he had been sleeping. Felicity stayed below, lying on a pile of empty feed sacks, staring up at the dark beams. The place where his hand had touched her skin still felt warm. They rode to town together 3 days later to file the water-sharing agreement. The trip to Prairie Dawn was a gauntlet. As they rode down the single dusty street, men stepped aside from the boardwalk to spit wide so their tobacco juice landed near Nidus's horse. Others simply stared, weighing Felicity with new eyes. The widow and the Indian arriving side by side. The whispers started before they even dismounted. At the combined land office and telegraph station, Felicity laid the ink-smeared agreement on the counter. The document was simple, written in her own careful hand, with Nidus dictating the terms. It granted his band the right to water their horses and draw drinking water from the spring in perpetuity, regardless of who held the deed to the land. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. The county clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a nervous cough, hesitated. He picked up the paper, read it twice, and set it down again. "There ain't nothing in the statute about Indians holding water rights," he muttered, not meeting her eyes. "Might be best if we delay recording this. Let the territorial judge take a look first." "How long?" Felicity asked. "A month, maybe 2. "I don't have 2 months." The clerk shrugged. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Can't record something that might not be legal." Lucia, listening from her telegraph desk in the corner, went very still. Her fingers, which had been tapping idly on the edge of the key, stopped. She looked at Felicity and Nidus, then at the clerk, and something shifted in her expression. Later upstairs in the cramped loft where she slept above the station, Lucia pulled a small black notebook from under her mattress and opened it on the table. Felicity and Nidus stood on either side of her, reading over her shoulder. On one page, in neat, cramped handwriting, Lucia had recorded 3 years ago, Virgil Cain to land agent in Goldwater, about correcting boundary around spring foreclosure clause ready. The date was months before Thomas Ward had ever signed his mortgage. Months before Felicity had even known there was a problem. "He planned this," Felicity whispered. "Planned to take the spring before Thomas was even in the ground." Lucia flipped to another page. "He's done it before. The McAllister Ranch, the Riley homestead, always the same pattern. A loan with terms that look fair until you miss one payment. Then the foreclosure comes fast before anyone can raise the money." "Why didn't you say something?" Nidus asked. Lucia looked at him steadily. "To who the sheriff works for the county, and the county listens to men like Virgil. The judge, same problem. I'm a woman operating a telegraph without a husband. If I start accusing powerful men of fraud, I lose my job and my license, maybe worse." "But you kept the records," Felicity said. "I kept the records," Lucia agreed. "Because someday, someone would need them." Guided by Lucia's notes, they pried open the warped door of the land office's storage room. It was a mess of mouse-chewed boxes, rolled maps, and forgotten files stacked against the walls. Dust hung in the air like fog. After coughing through the worst of it and dropping one crate on his own toes, Nidus found a survey map drawn by an Army engineer 5 years earlier. The spring was marked clearly inside a faint penciled line labeled Lakota Treaty Buffer, watering ground. In a rotting folder tucked behind a stack of old tax receipts, Felicity discovered something worse. It was an earlier, corrected deed bearing Thomas Ward's name, transferring a portion of the spring rights to Virgil Cain. The signature was too smooth, the letters shaped exactly like Virgil's own hand on other documents. "It's forged," she said, voice quivering. "He wrote my husband's name himself." Nidus held the paper up to the light. "This is enough to stop him," he said, "if we can bring it to someone who'll listen." "The army," Felicity said. "The fort. If the spring's on treaty land, the army has to care." Lucia nodded slowly. "I'll send a telegram to Fort Calloway tonight. But it'll take days for them to respond, maybe longer. You need to be ready for Virgil to move before they do." They left the land office with the map and the forged deed wrapped in oilcloth. On the street, people watched them go. Word was already spreading. At Dr. Theodore's office above the barber shop, the doctor cleaned a splinter out of Nidus's shoulder, where a broken crate had gouged him. He poured carbolic acid over the wound. The sharp chemical smell filled the small room. Nidus's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping near his ear. But he stayed perfectly still. Felicity, standing beside the exam table, lifted a clean cloth and held the edges of the cut closed while Theodore stitched. Their fingers brushed slick with disinfectant. She felt the heat of his skin and the control it took for him not to flinch. Neither of them pretended not to notice. Theodore tied off the last stitch and stepped back, wiping his hands. "Virgil won't fight this in court if he can help it," he warned. "He'll try to end it with lead before the army can respond." "We know," Nidus said. "We're ready." Back at the camp along the creek, Nidus called a council. The elders gathered in a circle, passing the army survey and the forged deed from hand to hand. They studied the penciled line on the map, the careful notes in the engineer's handwriting. Legally, the spring should still fall under the treaty buffer, managed by the federal government for Lakota use. Felicity's claim, based on a mortgage from Virgil, was weaker than she had ever imagined. Elsu, standing outside the circle with arms crossed, spoke sharply in Lakota. Nidus answered in the same language, his tone hard. The argument went back and forth, voices rising. Finally, Elsu switched to English, glaring at Felicity. "You could take this map to the fort," he said. "Let the officers drive her out and give all the land back to us. That's the law. That's justice." Felicity felt as if the ground had vanished under her feet. She stood very still, hands clenched at her sides. Every eye in the circle was on her. She forced herself to speak. "If that's what the law says," she managed, "maybe that's what should happen. I've been living on stolen land without knowing it." The circle was silent. The elders looked to Nidus. He stood with the map in his hands, staring down at the faint penciled line. He remembered being pushed off good hunting grounds, remembered army wagons burning lodges, remembered children crying in the snow because there was no food. At length, he folded the map and looked at Elsu. "There's room for more than one kind of grief at this spring," he said quietly. "We won't become Virgil to defeat Virgil." He turned to Felicity. "We use the truth on these papers to stop him not to throw you away. If we win this land, must show a different way to share." His choice to bind their fates instead of cutting her loose cemented their alliance. It also deepened the unspoken feeling between them and the thing neither had named, but both felt growing stronger each day. Elsu shook his head, but said nothing more. One of the elders said something in Lakota, low and approving. Nidus nodded once. "What did he say?" Felicity asked. "He said you have courage to stand before us and speak truth. He said that's worth more than paper." Felicity's throat tightened. "Thank you." Nidus looked at her for a long moment. "Don't thank us yet. Virgil will see us as one target now, When he strikes, he'll strike hard. Virgil answered with blood. One night, riders loyal to him swept through the Lakota camp along the creek, firing into lodges, cutting hobbles, driving off horses. The attack came fast and brutal, meant to scatter and terrify. An elder was trampled trying to protect the children. A young boy's arm was broken when he was thrown from a fleeing pony. Women screamed. Men grabbed weapons, but the raiders were already gone, vanishing into the darkness beyond the firelight. They left behind a burned blanket marked with Virgil's brand, a message as clear as any telegram. Elsu found Nidus at dawn, standing over the elder's body. The old man's chest had been crushed. His eyes were still open. "Our people bleed for her lone," Elsu said, voice trembling with rage. "For one white woman, the bullets find us." Nidus felt the accusation like a knife between his ribs. He knew Elsu was right. He knew he could still walk away, take his band deeper into the hills, abandon the spring to whatever happened between Felicity and Virgil. His people would be safer. The risk would be gone. But so would any chance of holding the line. If they ran now, Virgil would take the spring and close it. Other ranchers would follow his example. The treaty buffer would be eaten away piece by piece until there was nothing left. "We bury him with honor," Nidus said, "and we don't run. You're choosing her over us. I'm choosing to fight instead of run. There's a difference." Elsu stared at him for a long moment, then finally nodded. "Then we fight together, all of us." The shift was subtle but profound. Elsu stepped beside Nidus instead of behind him. The rift wasn't healed, but it was bridged. That evening, after the burial, Nidus found Felicity in the barn, sorting ammunition. She looked up when he entered, her face pale in the lantern light. He sat down beside her on the bench, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy with things unsaid. Finally, Felicity said, "I lost Thomas to a wagon accident. Or so I thought. Now I wonder if Virgil had a hand in that too. I wonder if I'll ever know." Nidus looked at her. "I lost my wife and daughter to a fever 5 winters ago. The medicine man said there was nothing to be done, but the army doctor at the fort had medicine that might have saved them. He wouldn't give it to us. Said his supplies were for soldiers only." Their eyes met. In that moment, they saw each other's grief laid bare, recognized the weight of loss that neither had spoken aloud until now. "I'm sorry," Felicity whispered. "So am I." Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand. He didn't pull away. They sat like that in the dim barn, hands clasped, two people who had learned that survival sometimes meant letting someone else see the wounds you carried. At the same time, the sheriff rode to Felicity's ranch with an eviction notice bearing the seal of the territorial judge. He was an older man, gray-haired, and stooped with a badge that looked too heavy for his vest. Foreclosure in favor of Virgil Cain. He read aloud, not quite meeting her eyes. "By the law of this territory, you got 7 days to clear out. After that, I'm bound to assist in removing you by force." Felicity's hand shook as she took the paper. The words swam in front of her. "If the law says it, there ain't nothing I can say back, is there?" The sheriff sighed. "You're a woman, Felicity. In the judge's eyes, you signed what your husband started. Men like Virgil write the rules. I just pin them to doors." He tipped his hat and rode away. Felicity stood alone in the yard, staring at the notice. The breeze tugged at the edges of the paper. For a long moment, she considered just walking away. Packing what she could carry, saddling the mare, and riding until prairie dawn was a memory. Then she walked to the barn, found a hammer and a nail, and drove the notice into the barn wall like a challenge. That evening, Nidus returned from calming his scattered band. He found Felicity sorting ammunition on the workbench, her face pale but her hands steady. "If you walk away now," she said hoarsely, "I won't blame you. But know this, if you leave, he wins twice. He gets the water, and he proves that people like us can be broken." Nidus studied the notice nailed to the wall, then her face. The exhaustion in her eyes matched his own. "We stand together," he said at last, "or we fall on the same dust." Outside, Barnaby Holt's wagon creaked into the yard. He climbed down slowly, favoring his bad back, and began unloading old fence posts and scraps of timber. His face was gray, his hands quivering slightly. When he glanced toward the spring on the hillside, something flickered in his eyes, guilt so raw it was almost physical. His lips moved as if he were talking to himself, but no sound came out. He looked away quickly, but not before Felicity saw it. "Heard you might need help reinforcing the pens," he muttered, still not looking at either of them. His voice was hoarse, strained. "Figured I should have done more, should have said something sooner, been meaning to—" He trailed off, unable to finish. The words hung in the air, weighted with something unspoken. Felicity stepped closer. "Barnaby," she said carefully, "what should you have said?" He froze, hands still on a fence post. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, red-rimmed. "Dang it, I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Barnaby set the post down and sank onto the wagon tailgate, shoulders slumped. He looked older than his years, hollowed out by something more than work and worry. "I used to work for the Army," he said quietly, voice breaking. "Surveying, measuring boundaries. That was years ago, before I took up farming. I was the one who mapped your spring. I told them it was good water year-round, never dried up even in bad years. I wrote it all down in the report. Drew the maps, marked the location precise as I could." Felicity's breath caught. "And Virgil found that report. I showed it to him," Barnaby whispered. And the confession came spilling out like water through a broken dam. "He asked me about water sources in the valley 3 years back, said he was planning where to graze his herds, where to dig wells. I didn't think. Heck fire, I didn't know he'd use it to steal land. I thought he just wanted information. By the time I realized what he was doing, Thomas was already gone, and you'd signed the papers." His voice cracked. "I should have warned Thomas, should have told him Virgil was circling. That morning, he went out with that wagon. I saw him leave. I almost rode over to help him, but I didn't. I stayed in my own yard like a coward because I owed Virgil money, and I was afraid. If I'd been there, maybe the wagon wouldn't have tipped. Maybe I could have—" He buried his face in his hands. "I killed your husband same as if I'd shot him myself. And I've been too darn scared to say it until now." The silence that followed was absolute. Felicity stared at him, a storm of emotions warring in her chest, rage, grief, pity, understanding. Nidus watched them both, his hand resting on the knife at his belt, waiting to see what she would do. Finally, Felicity spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're telling me now. I know it don't make up for nothing." Barnaby said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I know I'm a coward and a fool. But I'm here now. Whatever happens next, I'm standing with you. If Virgil comes, I'll face him. It's the only way I can look at myself again. The only way I can face Thomas when my time comes." Nidus stepped forward. "Words are easy. Dying is hard. Are you ready for that?" Barnaby looked up at him, eyes clear for the first time. "I've been half dead for a year. Might as well make it count." Felicity stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then you'd better mean it, Barnaby. because when he comes, it won't be with papers." "I know," Barnaby said, "and I'm ready." They spent the next 3 days preparing. Nidus knew the land better than anyone, every gully, every rock formation, every place where the ground was solid, and where it would give way under weight. He and Felicity walked the property together, planning. "Virgil's a prideful man," Nidus said as they stood on the hillside above the spring. "He'll want to make a show of taking this place. He won't sneak in quiet. He'll come loud and hard, trying to scare us off." "He'll use cattle," Felicity said, "like he did at the McAllister place. Drive a herd straight through, flatten everything." "Yes, but the land here is different." Nidus pointed to the narrow ravine that led from the back pasture toward the barn. "If we open that gate, the herd will split. Most will go through to the pasture away from the spring. But we need to make sure they go where we want. And if Virgil's men try to redirect them, then we make the ground work for us, not them." They spent hours digging narrow trenches in key locations, covering them with brush and dust. They weakened fence posts on one side of the yard so they would collapse inward, creating barriers. They positioned hay bales and old timber in strategic locations, creating channels that would funnel cattle away from the spring and toward the open pasture. Elsu and the other Lakota riders helped their movements efficient and silent. Barnaby worked alongside them, sweat pouring down his face, his bad back screaming with every shovelful of dirt. But he didn't stop. He didn't complain. He was a man seeking redemption, and redemption was paid for in sweat and pain. On the evening of the 6th day, Lucia rode out from town on a borrowed horse, her face drawn and pale. "Virgil hired 10 more men yesterday," she said. "They're camped 5 miles west. I heard them talking about moving at dawn tomorrow. They're bringing cattle." "How many?" Nidus asked. 200 head, maybe more." Felicity felt her stomach drop. "That's enough to bury us." "Not if we're smart," Nidus said. He looked at each of them in turn, Elsu, the other Lakota riders, Barnaby, Dr. Theodore, who had ridden out to stand with them. "We know this land. They don't. We use that." That night, as they made final preparations, Felicity found herself standing at the edge of the spring with Nidus. The stars were bright overhead, the air cool and clean. The smell of sage and dust hung in the breeze. "If we lose tomorrow," she said quietly, "I want you to know, I'm grateful you stood." "We won't lose," Nidus said. "But if we do—" He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Then we lose together. And that's worth something too." She nodded, unable to speak, past the lump in her throat. They stood in silence for a long moment, shoulders nearly touching 2 people on the edge of a battle. Neither was sure they would survive. Virgil didn't wait for the eviction notice to expire. Before dawn on the 6th day, a low rumble woke the ranch. Felicity sat up on her pile of feed sacks, heart pounding, straining to hear. The dream shadows flickered at the edge of her vision. Virgil's laughter, the circling riders, but this was real. From the loft, Nidus's voice cut through the dark. "Riders. Many. And cattle." He slid down the ladder and grabbed his rifle. Felicity pulled on her boots and followed him to the barn door. The eastern sky was just starting to gray, but the sound was unmistakable now. Hooves. Hundreds of them. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that drowned out thought. Nidus climbed the loft ladder again and looked out through a gap in the boards. What he saw made his blood run cold. A herd of half-wild longhorns, maybe 250 head, driven straight toward the ranch buildings from the west. Riders flanked the herd with whips and rifles, keeping the cattle bunched tight and moving fast. Behind the herd rode more men's shadows on horseback, spread out in a loose line. Dust rose in a choking cloud that turned the dawn red. Just like we thought, Nidus said, dropping down from the loft. He's trying to flatten us with a stampede. Then we give him what he expects. Felicity said, her voice steadier than she felt. Until we don't. They moved quickly. Nidus, Sioux, and the other Lakota riders mounted their horses and rode out to meet the herd from the east, making themselves visible. Felicity, Barnaby, and Dr. Theodore took positions behind the stone wall and water trough rifles ready. The plan was simple. Make Virgil think they were trying to turn the herd from the front, draw his men into chasing the Lakota riders, then use the prepared channels and weakened fences to split the herd and funnel it away from the spring. The key was timing. The rumble grew louder. The ground shook. Dust rose in a wall that blocked out the sunrise. The smell of cattle and fear filled the air, thick and choking. The stench was overwhelming: manure, sweat, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. Nidus and the others rode straight toward the front of the herd, shouting and waving blankets, trying to hook the lead steers. The cattle bellowed, eyes rolling, white foam flying from their mouths. The noise was deafening, a roar of hooves and voices that shook the air. Virgil's men saw them and spurred forward, firing rifles. Bullets kicked up dirt. One shot came close enough that Elsu's horse shied sideways. "Now!" Nidus shouted in Lakota. The riders split, racing toward the barn from opposite sides. The herd followed momentum, carrying it forward like a living avalanche. Virgil's men, thinking they had the advantage, drove their horses harder, trying to cut off the Lakota before they could reach cover. That was when the first trap sprung. 3 of Virgil's riders crossed the section of ground where Nidus and Felicity had dug shallow trenches and covered them with brush. The horses' hooves broke through. Animals stumbled and went down hard, throwing their riders. One man's leg snapped with a sound like a gunshot. Another was pinned beneath his fallen horse, screaming. The remaining riders pulled up short, suddenly wary. That hesitation cost them precious seconds. Nidus and Elsu raced toward the back pasture gate, the herd thundering behind them. Felicity sprinted from her position behind the trough and threw her weight against the gate. It swung open. The lead steers following the Lakota horses poured through into the back pasture. But not all of them. Some animals, panicked and confused, veered toward the barn. Virgil had anticipated the gate. He and 3 of his men drove their horses forward, firing into the air, trying to turn the herd back toward the buildings. "The fence!" Nidus shouted. Elsu swung his horse around and kicked hard at one of the weakened fence posts on the north side of the yard. The post snapped. The fence section collapsed inward, creating a barrier that channeled more of the herd toward the open pasture and away from the spring. Virgil saw what was happening, and his face twisted with rage. "No!" he roared. "Drive them through, flatten the barn." His men tried, but the cattle were already splitting. Most followed the path of least resistance through the open gate, away from the collapsing fence. Only a few dozen head veered toward the barn, and those crashed into the strategically placed hay bales and timber, breaking their momentum. The stampede that should have destroyed everything was fragmenting, its force dissipated by terrain and planning. Virgil saw his plan falling apart. In desperation, he spurred his horse straight toward the spring itself, a pistol in each hand. If he couldn't take the land by destroying it, he would take it by killing its defenders. He fired at Nidus. The bullet caught the Lakota warrior's horse in the shoulder. The animal screamed and went down. Nidus rolled clear, came up running, despite the pain in his thigh, where a longhorn's horn had grazed him earlier, blood seeping through his leggings. He grabbed for his rifle, but it was trapped under the fallen horse. Virgil leveled his pistol at Nidus's chest. "No!" Felicity screamed. Barnaby saw it all unfold, as if in slow motion. He saw Virgil's finger tighten on the trigger. He saw Nidus, unarmed and wounded, trapped in the open. He saw Felicity raising her rifle, but knowing she wouldn't be fast enough. And in that moment, Something broke free inside Barnaby Holt. All the years of cowardice, all the guilt, all the weight of Thomas Ward's death and his own complicity. It all came crashing down, and beneath it, he found something he thought he'd lost the willingness to pay a price. He didn't think. He just moved. Barnaby whipped his wagon team forward with a shout, driving the wagon directly into Virgil's path. The cattleman's horse tried to swerve. Too late. Horse and wagon collided with a sickening crunch of wood and bone. The impact threw Barnaby clear. He hit the ground hard, his leg twisting beneath him with a crack that echoed across the yard. But Virgil's horse went down. Virgil flew from the saddle, both pistols flying from his hands. He hit the dirt hard, stunned. The wagon momentum, still carrying it forward, tipped and began to roll toward where Barnaby lay broken in the dust. Nidus, freed from the immediate threat, launched himself forward despite his injured thigh and dragged Barnaby clear just as the wagon crashed down, splintering into wreckage. He hauled Barnaby behind the stone wall. The old farmer's leg was bent at a terrible angle. Bone showed white through torn fabric. His face was gray with shock, slick with sweat and dust. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth. "You darn fool," Nidus gasped. Barnaby coughed a wet, rattling sound. His hand scrabbled at Nidus's arm, weak but desperate. "Tell her." He coughed again, blood staining his lips. "Tell Felicity. I'm sorry. Tell her. Thomas would be proud she fought. Proud she didn't run." His eyes found Felicity across the yard. She was running toward them, rifle still in her hands, tears streaming down her face. "I should have been a better neighbor," Barnaby whispered. "A better man. But I'm glad I got to stand with you at the end. You stood," Nidus said, his voice rough. "That's what matters." Barnaby smiled just a little. Reckon Thomas will understand now. When I see him." His grip tightened one last time on Nidus's wrist, then loosened. His chest rose once more, then stilled. His eyes stayed open, looking up at the sky where the first rays of sunlight were breaking through the dust. Felicity dropped to her knees beside him, a sob tearing from her throat. She reached out and closed his eyes gently, her hands trembling. "He saved you," she whispered to Nidus. "He finally..." She couldn't finish. Nidus nodded, unable to speak. Across the yard, Virgil staggered to his feet, covered in dust and blood, one arm hanging at an odd angle. He fumbled for the derringer in his vest, his face twisted with rage and pain. Elsu appeared from the settling dust, his rifle leveled. "Don't," he said simply. Virgil froze. Around him, his remaining men were scattered, wounded, or fleeing. The herd was dispersing into the back pasture, the stampede broken. The spring was untouched. He had lost. Felicity walked over to him slowly, every step deliberate. She picked up the eviction notice that had been blown into the dirt and held it up in front of his face. This paper was built on lies. She said, her voice shaking with fury and grief. "On theft and murder, we have the proof. The Army's survey showing this land is treaty buffer. The forged deed with my husband's name. Lucia's records of your telegrams, all of it." She let the paper fall to the ground between them. "Your men will testify against you to save their own necks. The territorial judge will have no choice but to investigate. And when the Army sees what you tried to do to treaty land, you'll hang for it." Virgil spat blood. "You think you've won," he hissed. "You're still just a widow and a savage. No one will believe you." "They already do," said a new voice. Everyone turned. Lucia stood at the edge of the yard, her notebook in her hands. Behind her, emerging from the settling dust, came Dr. Theodore, the county clerk, and a small group of townspeople who had ridden out to witness what happened. They had seen everything, the stampede, the traps, Barnaby's sacrifice, Virgil's attempted murder. I sent a telegraph to Fort Calloway 3 days ago, Lucia said calmly. They're sending an officer to investigate. He should arrive by this afternoon. But I don't think we need to wait for him to know what justice looks like. The townspeople murmured agreement. The clerk stepped forward, his face pale. Mr. Cain, I'm placing you under citizen's arrest until the territorial authorities arrive. You're charged with fraud, attempted murder, and trespass on federal treaty land. Virgil's face went purple with rage, but he was outnumbered and unarmed. His own men had abandoned him. He had nothing left. Elsu and another Lakota rider bound his hands with rope. As they led him toward a horse, Virgil looked back at Felicity one last time. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes," Felicity replied quietly. "It is." The army officer arrived that afternoon, as promised, a young lieutenant with sharp eyes and a careful manner. He examined the forged deed, the army survey map, Lucia's telegram records, and took statements from everyone present. By evening, he had confirmed what they already knew. The spring lay within treaty buffer land. Virgil's claim was fraudulent, and his actions constituted both fraud against federal property and violent assault. Virgil Cain was taken into custody by the army and transported to the territorial capital to stand trial. His properties would be seized to pay restitution to his victims. The spring would remain treaty buffer land, with Felicity granted a lifetime lease as caretaker, not because of any deed or mortgage, but because the army recognized her as the person best suited to manage the water, for both white settlers and Lakota bands. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't complete justice. But it was more than they had dared hope for. In the days that followed, they buried Barnaby Holt on the hillside above the spring next to Thomas Ward. Felicity carved his name into a wooden cross with her own hands, tears streaming down her face as she worked. She didn't forgive him for his silence, but she honored what he had done at the end. He died a better man than he lived, Nidus said quietly as they stood over the fresh grave. "Maybe that's all any of us can hope for," Felicity replied. Dr. Theodore set up a small clinic in the old bunkhouse, treating anyone who came regardless of race. The Lakota rider who had been killed in the first volley was buried with full honors, attended by both white settlers and Lakota families standing side by side. It was the first time the two groups had grieved together. Lucia continued to run the telegraph, though certain families in town no longer spoke to her. She didn't care. She kept her notebook, kept recording, kept watching. Elsu's wounded arm healed slowly. He worked alongside Nidus to rebuild the damaged fences and pens, and one afternoon he found Felicity mending harness in the barn. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, then stepped inside and extended his hand. She looked at it, then took it. His grip was firm, his expression no longer hostile. "You fought like one of us," he said simply. "You bled for this land. That makes you kin." Tears pricked her eyes. "Thank you." He nodded once and left. It was as close to acceptance as she would get, and it was enough. Day by day, Felicity and Nidus rebuilt what the stampede had broken. They worked side by side, passing tools, their movements falling into an easy rhythm born of shared struggle. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they worked in silence. Both were comfortable. One evening, after finishing repairs on the barn door, they stood together, watching the sun set over the valley. Smoke rose from cook fires in both the Lakota camp and the scattered homesteads beyond. Children's voices carried on the wind. "What happens now?" Felicity asked quietly. "We keep working," Nidus said. "We keep sharing the water. We teach others that it's possible. And if they don't want to learn, then we keep teaching anyway." She smiled just a little. "That sounds like a long fight." "It is. but I've found someone worth fighting beside." He didn't look at her as he said it, but his hand found hers. She laced her fingers through his, holding on. They stood like that as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. Two people from different worlds bound together by water and blood, and the choice to stand when running would have been easier. The first snow of winter came in November, early and soft. Felicity woke to find the world transformed, every surface covered in white, the air sharp and clean. She could smell the cold crisp and metallic, mingled with the faint scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys. She pulled on her coat and walked up the hillside to where the two graves stood side by side, now 3 since Barnaby's cross had been added. The snow was already gathering on the wooden markers. Nidus was there, standing between the graves, his buckskin coat dusted with snow. His breath puffed white in the cold air. He didn't turn when she approached, but he shifted slightly to make room. They stood in silence for a long time. The snow fell steadily, muffling the world. The wind whispered through the bare branches of the cottonwoods along the creek, a soft sighing sound. Below them, the spring ran clear and cold steam, rising where it met the freezing air. The sound of the current was soft, constant. Snowflakes touched the surface and vanished, never accumulating, as if the water itself refused to be covered or claimed. Felicity reached out and rested her hand on Nidus's shoulder. After a moment, he lifted his own hand and covered hers. His fingers were warm despite the cold. Neither of them spoke. There were no words left that needed saying. In the valley below, smoke rose from chimneys in thin gray columns. A group of children, Lakota and white together, ran through the fresh snow near the banks of the creek, their laughter carrying on the wind like bells. One boy threw a snowball at a girl with dark braids. She dodged and threw one back. Another child, smaller, fell into a drift and came up laughing, covered in white. They played along the banks of the creek that fed from the spring in the space between the Lakota camp and the nearest white homestead on land that belonged to no one and everyone. Their voices rose bright and clear, unmarked by the divisions their parents carried. Felicity watched them, her throat tight. "They don't remember what it cost," she said quietly, her breath misting in the cold. "No," Nidus replied. "But we do, and we'll make sure they learn. Not to carry our anger, but to remember what we paid for them to play together like that." The snow fell harder now, thick flakes that clung to their hair and shoulders, dusting the graves at their feet. The world was being made new, covered in white, the scars of battle hidden beneath soft powder. Felicity's hand tightened on Nidus's shoulder. He turned his palm and laced his fingers through hers, holding on as if the wind might tear them apart. His grip was warm, solid, an anchor against the cold. They stood together on the hillside as the snow came down, two figures against the white, watching the valley transform. The children's laughter grew fainter as the snow thickened, but it didn't disappear. It echoed a promise that carried over the white landscape. The spring ran on below them, its surface shimmering with reflected light, never freezing despite the cold. Steam rose from the water in thin wisps, curling and twisting in the winter air. The sound of it was like breathing, constant, patient, eternal. Nidus looked at Felicity, snowflakes caught in her dark hair, her face pale but at peace. The scar on her side, hidden beneath layers of wool and cotton, no longer pulled when she moved. His thigh had healed, leaving only a thin line to mark where the longhorn's horn had torn his flesh. They bore their wounds quietly now, the way old soldiers did. "Reckon we made something here," he said quietly, his voice nearly lost in the falling snow. "Something that wasn't here before." "Not just us," Felicity replied, thinking of Barnaby's sacrifice, of Elsu's grudging acceptance, of Lucia's quiet courage, of all the people who had chosen to stand rather than run. "All of us together." "Yes," Nidus agreed. "All of us." The snow fell thicker now, blurring the edges of the world, erasing the boundaries between sky and earth. The children's voices rose again, closer now. They had moved nearer to the spring, playing at the very source of the water that had nearly cost so many lives. Felicity and Nidus turned together and began walking down the hillside toward the ranch, their hands still clasped. Behind them, their footprints marked the snow, two parallel tracks that walked side by side, neither ahead nor behind, equal in depth and purpose. The wind began to fill in their tracks, almost immediately swirling fresh powder into the depressions their boots had made. But it didn't matter. They had walked this path together, and they would walk it again tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. As they reached the bottom of the hill, one of the children, a Lakota boy of perhaps 6, ran up to them, his face bright with cold and joy. "Nidus," he called. "Come see the water doesn't freeze even in the snow." Nidus smiled, a rare expression that softened his features. "I know, little one. It never does." "Why not?" the boy asked. "Because it's strong," Nidus said. "Stronger than winter. Stronger than men who try to own it. It just keeps running no matter what." The boy nodded solemnly, then ran back to his friends. A white girl about the same age grabbed his hand, and they ran together toward the spring, their laughter trailing behind them. Felicity watched them go, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You think they'll remember?" she asked. "When they're grown, will they remember what we did here?" "Some will," Nidus said. "Some won't, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that we gave them the chance to play together in the first place." They walked the rest of the way to the barn in silence, the snow swirling around them. Inside, the horses stamped softly in their stalls, warm and fed. The smell of hay and leather and wood smoke filled the air, familiar and comforting. Nidus built up the fire in the small stove, while Felicity checked the animals. When she finished, she found him standing by the barn door, looking out at the white landscape. She moved to stand beside him. "I'm glad you came that morning," she said quietly. "Even though I was afraid at first, even though I misunderstood, I'm glad you came." "So am I," Nidus replied. He turned to face her, his expression serious. In the dim light of the barn, with the snow falling beyond the door, they looked at each other with the clear-eyed recognition of two people who had survived something terrible together and come out the other side, changed but not broken. Slowly, carefully, Nidus raised his hand and cupped the side of her face. His palm was rough with calluses warm against her cold cheek. Felicity leaned into the touch, her eyes closing for just a moment. When she opened them, he was still there, still looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite name but understood in her bones. "Whatever comes next," he said softly, "we face it together." "Together," she agreed. They stood like that for a long moment, the barn sheltering them from the storm, the fire crackling softly behind them. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the valley in white, making everything clean and new. The children's voices echoed one more time across the distance, bright and joyful and free. And beneath it all, constant and clear, the spring ran on.